Good afternoon. Welcome to our May 11th, 2021 work session. Up first, we have a 2021 legislative session recap with Senator Paul Quarterman and Delegate Brenda Cham. Senator, Delegate, thank you guys for being here with us today.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you guys having us here today. I know some of you were at the chamber here this morning, so I apologize if you hear some of the same talking points that we had this morning, but I think it's important, obviously, for the rest of the body to hear, and obviously the public as well. This session, I think as was said this morning, was unique. Each session in the General Assembly is unique in and of itself, but this one kind of took a whole new meaning. Delegate Cham, I'm sure we'll talk about some of the things that happened in the House. This was my first session, obviously, in the Senate, and things were a little different on that side as far as from the perspective of the conditions from the pandemic. We had multiple testing a week. We were obviously there were masks everywhere, which is the norm, throughout. But they constructed plexiglass cubicles throughout the floor of the Senate. So we were, again, tested multiple times a week on the floor with the mask inside these little boxes. It was very interesting where you couldn't see half the room, you couldn't hear sometimes. It just made conducting policy very, very challenging. The rest of the things, the public, there was a lot of accessibility for the public as far as to be able to view. There was everything was streamed. All the committee hearings were done basically virtually. The things that were done on the floor were live streamed as well, so there was much more accessibility for the community to view it. I would say I think the participation was a challenge for folks to be able to participate, in days in past, and what we're hoping, obviously, in the very near future, possibly the next session, if, somebody wanted to speak on behalf of a bill or against the bill or what have you, you could come to Annapolis during that bill hearing and sign up and, say your piece, so to speak. During this past session, there was a limited amount of people that could sign up. The sign-up process was somewhat confusing, especially if you weren't tech savvy to a certain extent. So it made a lot of that stuff challenging. That being said, at the beginning of the session, we started with what looked like a $2 to $4 billion deficit, and that's with a B. It ended up having a budget surplus. We ended up having 5 supplemental budgets from the governor, which is kind of unheard of, and went from about a $49 billion budget in the state to about a $53 billion budget with no deficit, and in the out years with no structural deficit. So from a financial perspective, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of the funding that's come down from the federal level, and as you guys are aware, the federal funds have come down through the state, and now we're seeing some of those funds then to come down through the local governments as well. One of the big things that first went off was the governor's Relief Act that's provided stimulus funds and tax credits to individuals and small businesses. Shortly after that, one of the biggest pieces of legislation that passed was Senate Bill 1. That provided funding over $500 million for the historical black colleges and universities throughout the state of Maryland. And then we also saw a lot of bills, and I'm sure Delegate Cham may touch briefly on those, in regards to some of the societal concerns and police reform that have been ongoing. Prior to the session, it was really kind of talked about as we were coming to Annapolis, and on both sides of the aisle of unknown how it was going to play out. Everyone didn't know if with the pandemic, if there would be an outbreak, if we would be there for the whole 90 days. Last year, the session obviously was cut short, so there was concern that would we be able to be there to conduct everything. We're obligated, constitutionally to pass a balanced budget. So the thought process going into it was we need to pass a budget, we need to address some of these societal concerns, and then we need to move on. But what ended up happening is we were there for a full 90 days, and we had a lot of bills. As a matter of fact, I think it was a couple thousand bills that were ended up presented, close to 1,000 bills had passed. I served on the Budget and Tax Committee, is what former Senator Serafini served on. I had the pleasure of serving on that with our other senator from Washington County, George Edwards. He gives his best, by the way, in regards to things that are happening here in Washington County and Hagerstown. But that was a unique experience as far as learning that things. Being on appropriations before, I had some subject matter knowledge going into it. There are a lot more things that go into that as far as some of the tax policy, and also gaming comes to that committee. So sports gaming, which passed referendum last year in the state of Maryland, there was a sports gaming bill that passed, and I think you'll see in the near future some opportunities in this part of the state where sports betting may occur. I mean, we know it'll happen at the Rocky Gap Casino out farther western Maryland, but there will be opportunities throughout the state, potentially here even locally, for folks to be involved in that. Additionally, there were some legislative bond initiatives that we were successful on. Most notably were a couple $100,000 to the Smithsburg High School, as well as the Hagerstown Aviation Museum. Obviously, they're outside of the city of Hagerstown, but notable nonetheless. In regards to the city, the last installment of UIP 1 was made by the state. It was about $2.25 million was made, so we're very thankful for Senator Serafini and his leadership on that, and we're all excited, I know, to see the Maryland Theater and things of that nature get reopened. There was about $500,000 to the YMCA of Hagerstown, and then also in the capital budget, there was $1.5 million towards the future plan Hagerstown Multi-Use Sports and Events Center. I mentioned earlier there was a supplemental budget. The governor in the supplemental budget directed about $1.5 million to the Hagerstown District Court, as well as $8.5 million towards the Hagerstown Multi-Use and Event Facility. Which brings us to that particular piece of legislation that I sponsored. Actually, Delegate Cham had cross-filed in the House in regards to the facility that's planned here for downtown Hagerstown. You know, as I talked about this morning, and I'm sure that other folks or not sure that I know that have asked in the past, you know, this was really and I was just having a conversation with a member outside, and he said that the stars aligned. It was quite frankly kind of a perfect storm of how things kind of all came together. There was a lot of people involved in this, you know, not only myself and Delegate Cham, but folks downstate. There's a lot of support for it downstate. And, you know, the thing is that the state really appreciates and understands what this can do for the city of Hagerstown. All told, this is going to be approximately $70 million of an investment into downtown Hagerstown. $10 million that I spoke of was from the capital budget, supplemental budget, and about $60 million by way of this legislation. The Stadium Authority will design, finance, and build the facility, and then they will turn the facility over to the Hagerstown Washington County Industrial Foundation. You know, before we get out here and I turn over to Delegate Cham, I just want to be clear, and I know we've had this conversation before. I think it's important for folks to understand because I don't know what we're going to call it exactly. You know, obviously baseball will be played there. You know, there was in the past effort, there was the music, it was discussed, the multi-use sports and entertainment complex. There's been some branding exercises in the past, and hopefully those will continue. But we're not building a baseball stadium, okay? This isn't about baseball. It's never been about baseball. It's about economic development and economic impact that this facility will begin or will bring. Again, that's what the state found intriguing. It's what they understood. And the bottom line is it's about investor confidence. It's about providing that investor confidence for the economic development and revitalization to one of the most impoverished areas in all of Washington County. Yes, of course, will baseball be played there? Well, sure, 70 nights of the year, there will be baseball played there. But I know Eric Menzer, who met with this group back in January, as he told you, and he'll be the first to tell to many, they're in the hospitality business. Baseball just happens to, occur there on certain nights of the year. And, I would never dare speak for Mr. Blackie Bowen, but I know that he would tell you the same thing. As excited as he is about baseball returning to the city of Hagerstown, what he's most excited about is all the other possibilities, all the other events, all the other things could happen in a facility like this, which will bring people to downtown Hagerstown, will provide that foot traffic, will provide that support for the restaurant, the retail, the commercial, the housing entities, and things of that nature. So, this is really a generational opportunity that we feel it can really change the trajectory of our community, not only in the city of Hagerstown, but obviously Washington County. And what we really see this being is an anchor for what the next urban improvement project could be. We just completed the most recent urban improvement project. We just talked about the last installment was made on that, and we're hopefully beginning to see even more, wins from that as the pandemic starts to go away to a certain extent. But we always have to keep moving forward. So I see this as an anchor for that next project to pair with hopefully some other housing opportunities within the city of Hagerstown, along with the continued neighborhood revitalization efforts in the Johnson Street community, as well as some infrastructure improvements here in the city with the hopeful addition of the third parking deck. So hopefully, and I look forward to the collaboration here with this body along with the other elected members here in Washington County, as we work together to share that common vision and common goal for the betterment of our community. Our office plans to work on, some of these during the interim. By all means, I would ask anybody here, as well as anyone listening, to please reach out to our office, please reach out to Delegate Cham's office, on anything that's been discussed not only today, but going forward of things you want to see in this community, things that you want to see the state get behind and support, so we can be involved and we can have that shared collaborative approach. So, again, I appreciate you guys having us here today. I'll you turn it over here to Delegate Cham.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to share that the session was very interesting, as you can imagine, due to the pandemic, but it was the best session ever for me because it was my only session. I don't have much of a measuring stick to measure it with, but nonetheless, we were able to get some good work done in the legislation, working across the aisle and working together to help pass some good bills for the state of Maryland. There were a lot of bills that came through the House. I think Delegate Wyville stated this morning at the Chamber of Commerce that there were almost 1,400 House bills and nearly over 400 Senate bills that made its way through. And some of those bills made it successfully into law that might be starting July 1st or October or in a couple of years. And then there are some bills that didn't quite make it through. So I'm just going to go over a few of what those bills may entail. My committee assignment in the legislation over the Maryland General Assembly was on the Judiciary Committee, and I also served on the subcommittee of Public Safety and Family Law. So there were a lot of bills other than police reform. People tend to think that that's all we talked about, but there were many, many bills that have covered things like diminution credits for people who are incarcerated, registered sex offenders being allowed or not on school property, inmate training, JOB Act, life sentences for juveniles, vet care of retired law enforcement, LEO, law enforcement officers, prohibition of sexual activity with victims. That is a law, can you imagine? And also rental assistance for people who need it due to COVID, expungement of records, criminal records, for people who are out of jail and for a certain period of time, if they've not committed any crimes, looking at having their records expunged. So there were a lot of bills that came through judiciary that made it through or not. But I'm going to cover some of the police reform package of bills, because I believe there's a misperception out there that it was just one bill, but there were many bills that made it under the umbrella of police reform. And there were exactly 4 bills that were included under that package, 4 separate bills. The first bill is Senate Bill 786, and that bill was mainly for Baltimore City. I don't know if you're aware of Baltimore City, but they are under the guidance, if you will, of the state of Maryland. So they don't have their own police department that they control. But one of the senators put in a bill to propose that this Baltimore City can be their own oversight. They can have oversight of their own city, and I believe that bill passed and is on the governor's desk. Another bill under the police reform package of bills is Senate Bill 17, and what that bill entails is using body-worn cameras of all of our police officers, as well as employee programs for counseling and mental health supports for law enforcement officers, and use of force. That bill is a little controversial because, as you may or may not know, the use of body-worn cameras can be very expensive. They're very useful, absolutely, and they're very needed when law enforcement officers are out in the street and pulling people over, that it's able to capture that interaction with that citizen that they pulled over. But it's very costly for local jurisdictions to be able to pick up the costs for the equipment, for the storage of the video, for redacting information from the video. So we're hopeful that the state is going to provide some support and funding to law enforcement agencies to be able to pay for things outside of the equipment. Another bill that was a part of a package of bills is Senate Bill 178, and that bill also was quite controversial because it focused on search warrants and inspection of records relating to police conduct. During this particular debate on the floor, I offered an amendment because the current bill was asking for 20 seconds when that officer knocks on the door, makes the residents in the home aware that they need to get in. They have 20 seconds to open the door for police officers. If they do not open the door within 20 seconds, that police officer can then burst down the door to enter the home. My amendment to that was to reduce it to 15 seconds based on a Supreme Court case out of Nevada that determined that 15 to 20 seconds was enough time for the resident to hear the officers knock on the door and to open the door. But unfortunately, that amendment failed, and now into law is 20 seconds. So that bill, we felt, was really tying the hands of law enforcement officers to be able to get into the home. It stresses the fact that during that 20 seconds, a lot can happen in that 20 seconds. People could try to escape out the window, they could be flushing drugs down the toilet, things of that nature. But nonetheless, the bill states that 20 seconds before the law enforcement officers can enter the residence. The last bill is House Bill 670. I think that bill probably garnered the most conversations out here. I had many conversations with our very own Police Chief Kiefer through text, or I had a Zoom call with him and some of his staff in the police department. I called him quite often over the session to kind of get his input and insight. And by serving on Judiciary Committee, I was able to listen to lots of testimony from parents who may have been affected by policing gone wrong. I was able to listen to testimony by experts within law enforcement. I was able to listen to police chiefs and people in that statute. Very long hours, many hours, lots of reading. Get back to your hotel room, you finish your judiciary Zoom call at 10, then you do your own studying to help you understand the information that's presented in the bills. So when this bill hit the floor in January, it was really a beast of a bill. It looked very ugly. There was a lot of anti-police verbiage, defund the police verbiage that was incorporated in House Bill 670. And during the first reading of that particular bill, 670, I voted no because I didn't feel that it was a good bill, a good enough bill. So there were lots of amendments that were offered by the Maryland Chief of Police, the Fraternal Order of Police. They offered lots of amendments to help make the bill more palatable. This particular bill also strikes LEOBR, which is Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, that has been in existence since the early 1970s. But it replaces the LEOBR with the multi-step system that will involve a number of different boards and appellate processes. Citizens will be permitted to serve on trial boards and these administrative charging committees. The police chief will be responsible for assigning citizens to serve on these boards. So hopefully they're going to be vetted properly so that that police officer can be afforded the opportunity for a fair hearing if they are charged with anything. So officers still continue to have rights to protect them when and if charges are made against them. I think the misperception out there is that officers no longer have rights, so I want to make it openly clear that they do have rights. Transparency is important in our community. I've had those conversations with Police Chief Kiefer. Accountability is appropriate and is needed in our communities to make sure that those stops and interaction between law enforcement and community are appropriate. Also included in the HB 670 is law enforcement officers will be afforded scholarships for funding to pay for degrees that they may want to pursue for higher learning, going to college and earning a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. Millions of dollars have been set aside in the budget to help that police officer paid for schooling, so that's certainly a good point within the bill. The bill is not perfect, and I often say we can't allow perfect to be the enemy of the good. It's a good bill, and by the time if the bill was on third reader, I voted yes on this particular bill with the hopes that it won't scare off police officers, but if anything, invite potential police officers into the fold of law enforcement if they know that there is some protections afforded to them. I also want to make it poignantly clear that I'm certainly not anti-law enforcement. Law enforcement have hard jobs to do when they're out in the streets, when they leave their homes and leave their families to go out and go to work. The job can be very hard, and I support them in their efforts that they do every day. There's some bad apples out there, of course, and hopefully those bad actors will be weeded out and move on to other professions other than policing if their interactions in the community with citizens are not appropriate. The last bill is Senate Bill 600, and that bill entails the use of surplus military equipment as well as investigation of deaths caused by police officers. I had a conversation with Police Chief Kiefer about this particular bill using weaponized surplus military equipment, and he informed me that Hagerstown doesn't really use that type of equipment in their law enforcement agency, so that was good to know. So that's the gist of all of the bills that fell under the police reform package. There were 5 different bills. They each had their own components in which they play into the whole police reform that came through the General Assembly. So on a lighter note, we were able to secure some funding for the Robert Johnson Community Center in the amount of $100,000 to help them bring their building up to code and to fix things that need to be fixed. There was also a $50,000 matching grant that was dropped, I believe, when Delegate Wilson was a part of the delegation. And unfortunately, the Robert Johnson Center was unable at that time to match the funding of $50,000. But I was able to have some conversations with people at the state to drop that $50,000 matching fund. So a total amount of money that the Robert Johnson Center has coming to them is $150,000. So I'm hopeful that that money will be put to good use to fix and repair some things that are needed. I also met with Lieutenant Governor Boyd Rutherford to talk about the opioid crisis. As I understand it, Washington County was hit the worst, particularly during the COVID crisis, regarding opioid and the use of illegal drugs. So the conversation that I had with him, pretty much I asked him, what are there further resources that you can afford us that we can tap into, be it monetarily or grants or things of that nature. And he assured me that he is in our corner to fund and to find us more monies to improve the area of opioid crisis. I also met with Mayor Keller and Victoria Sterling with the Washington County Health Department she's the Director of Behavioral Services, to have some extended conversations about what our needs entail and if there's something that we're missing to help rid this crisis out of our community, because we want to encourage people that the use of illegal drugs and opioids and things of that nature is certainly not the right path to go down to help them meet whatever challenges that they have. So I'm hopeful that some good conversations will come out of that with the use of potential grants and maybe even possibly proposing some legislation and some bills. I'm also scheduled to go to Frederick to meet and tour the Detox Center in June, just to get an idea of what they're doing in Frederick County. That date, I didn't write it down, but I know it's sometime in June. I'm hoping to meet with the person there, the director of the center, to sort of tap into them and their resources to see if that's something that we can consider, and we'll have further conversations, Mayor Keller, about that. That's pretty much all I have that came out of the General Assembly. Certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know.
I don't have any questions, just to piggyback off of the subject you were just talking about. I appreciate you meeting with Vicki and I that day. That was a great conversation. Had some ideas about legislation, like you mentioned, specifically regarding hotels and other things that could be beneficial to our community and others. I just want to stress and reiterate the need, desperate need in this community for a 24-hour crisis center. Detox is also needed, but a crisis center, give you an example. Thursday night, got a phone call, 9 p.m., someone desperately needed help, didn't think they were going to make it through the night. Pulled just about every string I knew possible. Had that person lined up with the help of Petros from Awakenings Recovery Center to go to one of 2 detox centers in Maryland the very next morning. They left at 5 a.m., but it was 9 p.m. at night, and this person was in severe crisis. And he had to make it till 5 a.m. in the morning until he was around a peer recovery specialist. Luckily, we had peers, say we, the health department, Victoria, had peers that were willing to go out to where he was staying at 9 and 10 and 11 o'clock at night to sit with him and coach him and give him guidance. But he was alone from 11 o'clock at night when the peers left until 5 o'clock in the morning when he was picked up by someone. And that can't happen. That can't help it. I mean, it's just a miss that we're missing in this community big time. We all know people who are struggling with substance use disorder, and when they say, I'm ready, that's it, they're ready. And when they say, I don't think I'm gonna make it through the night, and there's a really big chance they're not gonna make it through the night. And we were very lucky in that circumstance that he did make it through the night. But imagine how everyone that was involved trying to get that person help, including his family and everyone else, would have felt if he didn't. So I hope that that's something we can look at seriously. I know the health department has worked on it previously, and there's kind of a shortage of providers, but it is something that we really, truly need in this community, and we're missing the boat on.
And there are conversations going on between Meritus and Brooks House, myself included, so maybe you and I can get together and talk about, you know, you can send me an email or a text. I'll respond.
Thank you.
But there's some behind the scene, you know, things that are, conversations that are taking place that you should probably be a part of.
Sure.
Do you guys have any questions or?
I have a couple of comments. The first comment is thank you for the information on the police-related bills. That was much more informative than the stuff that you simply read as a citizen day to day. It definitely puts it in a bit broader perspective than you know, the information that we're provided through various other media outlets. And then the second thing is I wanted to touch on Senator Quarterman's comments regarding music, and maybe to first say congratulations on the effort of that coalition. And I say that because I think that there is a bit of a misnomer, and I think we had this conversation with the county this morning where, you know, if we have different perspectives on items, it certainly does not mean we are, you know, diabolically opposed. It means we have different perspectives on community initiatives. And, you know, we also have 2 very different seats that we sit in terms of how we represent that process and the efforts, you know, to accomplish those priorities. And I say that, you know, from this seat, what we heard, and even when you were a council member for the city, I'm sure you heard the same thing from our city residents, is, you know, the idea is, has merit, but as city residents, we don't want to pay for it. We don't want to own it. We don't want to manage it. We don't want to maintain it. And we don't want to carry the debt burden. And so I say congratulations because your office and the coalition associated was able to find a way to accomplish that and not have any of those things occur for the city resident that I think that they were fairly clear about. And so I appreciate the efforts there. I will also say that I hope that you appreciate that during that course of effort, you know, that as it applies to the coalition's efforts, that we did remain as you requested, neutral on that process of the coalition's efforts. And the other two things I would say is, I think I've been very clear that as you have now achieved this process, and I've said it from day one, I've said it, I think Councilmember Brucci has said it, we needed that parking deck yesterday. And so for me, I stand as ready as necessary, at least from this seat, to make sure that the parking deck happens, because I believe that we should invest in the infrastructure if private efforts are going to invest, you know, in economic development. And so I know it's in our budget. I believe that we're, you know, behind as it is in securing the property, getting the plans, and getting that process up and running. And the other two things I had on that, one is I appreciate your comments regarding sports betting. We actually had a bit of zoning discussion on that a couple of months ago, and all I said during that process is these two things. One is I want to make sure that I understand what the state is going to pass, so we understand how it's going to impact us if we adopt that type of use, because while I certainly agree with the premise and the idea of a sports betting parlor, that type of environment, I do not believe that the music would be an appropriate place for a casino like Rocky Gap. I just think that they're two very different, you know, dynamically operating venues. And so I hope that you understand the difference that I have in that particular item. And then the last thing I'll say is, and I know that you don't really have any control over this, and I know that now that it's really a private effort, we don't really, at least for me, I'll just say for me, I don't really have a great desire to see the phase plan. But I think as it relates to our parking deck, as it relates to the cultural trail, we'd certainly welcome being able to see that, I think it's the phase 2 plan.
It's,
You're gonna see it next week.
Okay, so there, that answers that question. And that's all I have.
Now, and look, just to respond, I appreciate those comments sincerely. A couple at the end, the game, and I think you bring up some very good points about the game, and I did see your conversations a couple weeks ago, and I agree with your position then and now, because I think there was a lot of unknowns as that bill was being worked through. I mean, that bill wasn't even passed till it was either the last day of the session or the day prior of where the license were gonna go, who was gonna have the possibility to have them. At one point, it was gonna be just off-track betting facilities. Another point was gonna be just, you know, the casinos. And then at a certain point, the Senate bill, you could have it, pretty much anybody who had the means to apply for one could apply for one. There would be a kind of a commission that went through lottery. A lot of that has been narrowed down to the legislation that was passed. I think, though, to answer your one particular question as far as what these facilities are envisioned, or exactly what you're talking about, is what I think what you and I would describe as a sports betting parlor, not casinos, not a casino as a la Rocky Gap or Horseshoe or something like that. So where you'll see these things come up, and that's why they talked about the off-track betting facilities and things of that nature. They would be a complement to existing facilities, whether it was an existing gaming facility or whether it was, you know, in theory, a local bar and grill. You know what I mean? Now, again, I think that's where using that knowledge and using, you know, the legislation, how it was passed to help with some of the zoning things that you guys are discussing, I think will be important to try to be able to have a clear understanding of what would be best for the community, of where these facilities could or could not be located. So I think, though, that a lot of those questions should be answered now that the legislation has been passed, and I appreciate that understanding going through that, and I agree with you, kind of let's hold and let's see how this thing shakes out first before we make a decision one way or another. As far as the phase 2, like Scott, I think just touch base on that. My understanding that's going to be coming out here in the very near future, and I think it's important, regardless of going forward of you know the industrial foundation being involved, you know, as the ownership of the facility when it's completed. I think it's important not only for this phase, but even the other subsequent phases to continue to provide updates. Look, this thing's going to be in downtown Hagerstown. Now, just like any other economic development project, especially something this magnitude, I think it's best that we are on the same page and continue to have the communication open, because, you know, as these things go through, there's going to be a lot of things that go into it, whether it's the parking garage that you talked about as far as the complementary infrastructure. The cultural trail obviously is of concern of this body and the citizens of Hagerstown, as it should be, and how that's going to be worked into it. So, you know, just because The legislation has now kind of put this project in the hands of the Industrial Foundation. I want to make no mistake here that it doesn't mean the city of Hagerstown will not still be involved, because I think it's important that we have a partnership going forward, in this project, because again, it stands to be one of the largest, if not the largest investment the state of Maryland's ever made in this part of the state, let alone the city of Hagerstown. So I appreciate having those continued conversations.
Thank you. Do you guys have any?
Just thank you very much for your presentation.
Mayor, if I could just, two things. I was actually going to save it for my comments at the end, but since we're there. Spoke to MSA on Friday. MSA has reached out to Arcane K, which is the developer of the concept plan, and waiting to get a confirmation of them to present phase two on the 18th. So I'll say that's a tentative date, but they would still look to release the public final draft on that day. I'll get it to you all. I've been allowed to get it to you all a little earlier than that, and kind of put the bow on our piece of all this, because from this point on, basically it gets turned over to the group that's going to have the stadium, and let it go on from there. And also, Joey, Chief Kiefer unfortunately can't be with us tonight. He is on the agenda. He can't be with us. He had a family issue he had to take care of this evening. So we'll try to get him on to talk about the HPD's impact on the legislation that was passed. But I can tell you, we met 2 weeks ago with command staff to talk about how the effects of the legislation would affect our police department. And we are very fortunate in that many of the reforms that were passed, our police department already does and has been doing. We have had body cameras for the last 5 years. All of the requirements that they were putting on the storage and the use of body cameras, we already do, which is a good thing. Some of the other reforms were basically modeled after the CALEA certification. That is I think it's every 3 years they get recertified, but every year they get reevaluated. And a lot of those things we already do as well. So ultimately, I think it is going to cause some concerns when it comes to recruiting and retaining some officers. So we are meeting on a monthly basis with the rank and file of the police union to talk through those things. We actually meet again tomorrow to talk about retention and recruiting and things we can do to try to maintain the quality of service that we have, which is excellent, and of which it is not being impaired whatsoever by any leaving of police officers, or we actually have ramped up the recruiting efforts and are getting more interest in being a police officer. It's not a city-specific issue. It is a regional and a countrywide issue that police forces are facing, and I think ultimately we're going to be positioned very well based upon our previous rules and regs that we followed before. So, but Joey will still be available to come in later to talk about in more specifics.
So we're gonna have the phase two prior to our goal setting on the 18th.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Cool. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Thank you. Thank you guys
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. All right, up next, we have fiscal year 2022. Ooh, budget review, Michelle and Brooke. Huh? I'm running you out. Sorry.
Good afternoon. I should
Good
say, maybe good
afternoon.
evening, right? We are actually going to take a minute and go ahead and invite Jonathan Kearns to come up as well. Since we have a little bit of time this evening, as we are walking through some of the budget items, I think it's a great opportunity for us to just, and again, just like we have been, maybe not so so much focus specifically on a number within the Community Development Block Grant Program, which we typically refer to as CDBG, all these acronyms and initials. But again, an opportunity to discuss the overall program, some of the limitations, how it impacts the community and the things that we're able to do with the funding, because this funding, predominantly the majority of the revenues that we get are from a federal source, and they're from HUD. And there's very rare, and I shouldn't say rare because it's been happening more often, but there's few times where we will have our own local program income, and that typically arises if we have prior CDBG's monies that we have utilized and invested in a property that then we later sell. And when we resell those properties, it becomes program income, still has to stay within the overall CDBG program, still has to be used for those types of items that meet eligibility requirements there, but we are required to utilize that first before we can continue to utilize current and prior year unused balances for our HUD money. In your packets, I know that we included several different pages. Community Development Block Grant Program and Economic Redevelopment we'll talk about next are other governmental type of funds, meaning that we don't treat them as an enterprise fund in that you treat them like a for-profit business where their charges for services have to be sufficient to cover their operational needs. And I think what we'll do is look first and foremost, I'm probably just gonna jump to page 6, and there was some information in the packet. This specifically, and Jonathan, you can just jump in wherever you need. This specifically looks at and breaks down the revenue, and I think one of the primary things for us to focus on is that often we hear, oh, well, if we only have a specific entitlement award of like $800,000, how in the world can we do like $2 million in expenses? And it's because we might only have $800,000 in a current year entitlement award, but we also have prior awards that we're spending. So on page 6, when you start to see all these, they start with the B number, 14, 15, the whole way to 21. So B21 is just a fancy title for what the city's fiscal year 22 funding is. And our fiscal year 22 funding, when we very first started this process, we estimated that it was going to be $800,000. Right after we finished and were working through the budget process and the budget book, probably about a week before it was delivered, Jonathan, I want to say, we found out in March what we were actually going to receive. And the chart at the top, again, just shows you, like if we look at fiscal year 22, and you look at total grants, we're planning on spending and utilizing 1.6 million. Of that, 800,000 is B21, which is fiscal year 22 entitlement money. If you look at the bottom section, which is the chart, what happens with these entitlement dollars is, as we get them, Jonathan has to develop a plan, and they're very specific, and there's, again, all these restrictions on what is eligible and what is not eligible. And just because we might use up $500,000, it doesn't go back to the oldest entitlement that is remaining open. It literally goes block by block. So it's become a challenge, I think, to keep track of all these different things.
Yeah, about 6 years ago, HUD changed the process with the CDBG program when it came to the city of Hagerstown recapturing our funding through all of our CDBG expenditures locally, and then each month we reach to our line of credit through HUD to pull that money back. I believe it was 2014 and previous, it would always just go to the oldest amount of CDBG funding in the line of credit. In 2014, 2015, HUD changed to annual grant-based accounting, so that's why you're seeing all the different numbers still remaining in some of the older entitlements. And each year, some activities may come under budget, some activities may have less demand through our repair and renovation programs, and that money stays with CDBG. That sometimes makes it more complex in the budget process, whereas our general fund dollars typically zero out each year and you start over. With CDBG, it always stays there, and we keep working on it over time to keep it spending and moving. And one thing to note too, I think that that throws off some of the numbers this year is the CDBG CARES Act funding, which is also included in the revenues. So the roughly $2 million in revenues that are showing, or expenditures, about $750,000 of that is CARES Act funding through the CDBG CV coronavirus response funding.
Correct. And actually, you kind of stole my thunder. No, I'm only teasing. So at the top where you see the grants, normally you would only ever see these B numbers. And again, the 21 just indicates that it's the federal fiscal year 21, but it's our city fiscal year 22. So again, sometimes the differences in the time periods don't always line up. That's why we like to go ahead and just remind everybody. But if you look in fiscal year 22, total grants that are coming from HUD, we're looking at being reimbursed or utilizing $1.6 million. Again, I think Jonathan touched upon it. What happens with these grants, we're granted this money and it's awarded, it actually stays and sits at a federal office until Jonathan and his staff utilize and spend the money and submit monthly reports and request draws. So of the $1.6 million that we have in fiscal year 22 in federal dollars, $465,000 of that, again, is the two different buckets of money that we got specifically related to CARES. And again, just as a reminder, this body had previously approved both the first round and the second round and how it was being allocated and utilized throughout our community through nonprofits. So I think
We can give an update on that, actually. Out of the approximately $747,000 of the CDBG CV funding that we've been provided, nonprofit organizations that have been awarded that funding through round 1 and round 2 have spent just at about $460,000. So we're at 61% of the overall CARES Act funding pot. I'm very pleased with that, I think, after a year. The first allocations are almost fully spent. And expenditures of the second round that was recently approved by this body in March, I believe, was the day we announced the awards to the most recent applicants. They're starting to have expenditures come in as well. So I'm pleased with that timeliness of CDBG CV funding. So I think, again, 61% just 12 months after we received the initial award announcements is a good place to be right now.
yes.
And one of those was the Horizon Goodwill Breakfast Program, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
And that was the
Yeah.
second, yes, the second round.
So I visited with them, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and they had already started that program. I think it was Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, don't quote me, but the 3 days a week that they were doing it, they were sold out every single day, people coming and getting a hot breakfast. And because of that, other organizations are now donating a warm breakfast for the other 2 days to supplement.
Wow,
So,
that's great.
good.
And that's a wonderful
turnout.
story. It's not just a wonderful story for us, but for the community
Yeah.
and the needs. So that's a great utilization of this money. So again, overall on the revenue, if we would just, again, at the bottom of the chart, we reflect about 5 years of history here. We're actually showing you what is awarded every single year. The only difference is you see fiscal year 22, we estimated and projected it would be at $800,000. When we actually received notification, it came in at about $823,000. So we have another $23,000 that Jonathan can find ways to utilize above and beyond what we've already anticipated using in our budget. So that would mean if we just look at the entitlement dollars, that's a 2.3% increase over what we were allotted for fiscal year 21. And I think that that's again, a good story. One of the things that happens throughout this program is, they give us this money, but then come the end of April, there's this whole compliance deadline, and every year, I don't know if Jonathan Kearns makes me more nervous or vice versa, but we're always, where are we? Because there's, our year, of course, starts July 1, but by the following April, we have to have a certain percentage spent in total entitlement dollars so that we don't jeopardize or risk future monies. They want to make sure that what they're setting aside and providing us to utilize in our communities, that we are actually doing it. And good news, we met that this year, correct?
Yes.
All right, so the next page is just more details and a breakdown, but instead of looking at the revenues, it's in different components and ways that it is being allotted and allocated across CDBG, meaning how are we spending it? So we're getting these dollars, and you can see the dollars we're getting on page 6, but at the end of the day, where is Jonathan helping us to spend this in our community? The first section is just commercial and industrial improvements, and you can see we have some monies there in commercial property rehab loans.
And if I could touch on that, Michelle, and we're gonna have a more detailed discussion on the CDBG plans and programs in June, because we'll have actually a separate legislative action to vote on the CDBG plan approval. The commercial property rehab loan would be a new program that we're looking at, and it actually wouldn't be a loan, it would be micro enterprise grant assistance. Just with the shape of small business and some of the impacts through the COVID pandemic, something we thought we would propose would be a micro enterprise grant assistance program for small businesses within the city of Hagerstown. They would have to income qualify as an owner of a small business that has no more than 5 employees, including the owner. And we'll get into more detail on that during the June discussion, but that is essentially a small business grant program that we're looking to start for the first time in fiscal year 2022.
The next line, clearance and demolition, and I know that's a line item in the city allocating some dollars for a subject that's near and dear, at least Councilmember Alshire's.
He does love it.
I know, right? Incredible timing, I'm very sorry. But again, we allot money and anticipate that we're gonna utilize it, but within CDBG, it's not as simple as we saying, hey, Jonathan, we got this property, come demo it, can we utilize the CDBG monies? And what does Jonathan typically say?
There are a lot of considerations for using demolition with CDBG funding due to the potential change of use of the land after the demolition. And I've always tried to be cognizant of not putting the city in a scenario where there's an immediate need for a demolition, but there's no planned use of that particular lot at that time. 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when we're gone, if there's a decision made where that land changes use to a non-CDBG eligible use, it could potentially put the city at risk for having to pay that funding back. So it has to be very strategic in how it's used for demolition. We do see some opportunities to use it in the near future with some of the vacant blighted tax sale parcels, so there is some budget money in the budget assumed for use for demolition, but we just have to be very strategic and very cautious in using that.
I'm gonna skip
that
over the
use.
next couple lines, and then we're gonna look at public facilities and improvements. And if you look in fiscal year 22, there's about $735,000 there. Out of all those lines, other than the one that says loan, $595,000 are actually City of Hagerstown projects and are within our capital improvement project listing and details back in the section. So again, some of the projects we're able to utilize, it's very specific, very neighborhood specific and for very specific reasons. And Jonathan is good about keeping us all on track on making sure that we don't use that money somewhere that it's not eligible. The next section is all about public services, and I think one of the things I want to mention there is that public services, there is an actual cap or a limit that is imposed every single year. And Jonathan, you remember what that cap is under public services?
Yes, it's 15% of the current year entitlement amount, the sum of the entitlement amount plus the program income received from the previous fiscal year. So during budget season, calculating that cap is always a moving target. So for FY22, we have to look at the FY22 entitlement amount, and we have to project the FY21 program income amount. 15% of the sum of those two numbers is the cap. Right now, we're projecting FY22's public service cap at around $175,000. That could change depending on property sales or things like that sometimes that pop up that are unexpected. But the safe number that we're looking and using for FY22 is $175,000.
And there is a little asterisk right at the title where it says public services, and the asterisk is if you flip the page or go to the next, we do not expect anybody, even myself, to remember what that cap and that limit is. So we just put a little asterisk, and when you turn the page, if you look at the bottom, we will tell you what that specific formula is, what it's looking at. Just as a reminder, and also just so that we can try to be as transparent as possible with these dollars. The other thing to mention is, at the time that we produce and do all these documents for budget, there is an entire separate process that Jonathan and an independent committee utilized to determine who's going to be eligible to receive these public services dollars. And so at the time that we print, and at the time that I make Jonathan key in all these numbers, he might not have everything back. So one of the things we did is, in the middle there, we got this potential mid-year modification, and it's just where we put an additional dollar amount that Jonathan later, and again, it could be in June when he comes back and meets, but as he will finalize the plan and in more detail, it comes back to this body, and then we will actually reallocate that to the specific organizations that are going to be awarded those dollars. The bottom section is housing rehab, and this can be anything from emergency repairs to loans to, there's one here, and I just want to take a minute to acknowledge it as well. About 3/4 of the way down, it says code admin, code administration, part-time inspector, and you will see there that we have been very fortunate that we're able to utilize some of the CDBG funding to help fund one of our part-time positions, our inspector positions in code administration. So again, as we're going through, I'm just trying to point out any of the dollars that we are keeping locally back within our own City of Hagerstown budget, just full disclosure. If we flip the page, we'll come to the one where it says administration, and this administration has 2 asterisks, and it has 2 asterisks because just like public services, it also has a limitation that is set annually that we are not permitted to spend more than, but the formula there is a little bit different. Jonathan?
Yes, so the administration cap for CDBG every year is the current year entitlement amount plus that same current year's program income, which is even more difficult to calculate because you have to thoroughly speculate on the program income number in the upcoming year. So we have to be cautious that we're not over budgeting. We have to be very conservative with that number. So 20% of the FY22 entitlement plus the planned or anticipated program income to be received in FY22, 20% of that number is our admin cap.
And again, once that's all said and done, for fiscal year 22 at the bottom, you'll see that we have planned or estimated at the time that we prepared the budget to spend about $2 million overall. Again, this money is very restrictive. It's not like that we get this entitlement dollars and I'm utilizing it somewhere else. We don't put it to the water fund to help reduce rates. We don't put it within the general fund to help offset other places. Again, it's very restrictive, and we are cognizant of that. There's limitations that are in place on both the public services and on the administration side. Once we get to June 30 and we look at final closing our fiscal year in July and August, again, it's one of those other times where Jonathan and I are back and forth. Hey, where does our final numbers look? Are we where we need to be? Because that, again, is part of our audits and part of one of the very small things that they look at when they do the overall, our own third-party independent auditors, SB and Company, but also there's a separate process and a separate audit that we go through with HUD. That separate process with HUD, that audit is not every single year, though. Jonathan, was there any specific area that it did not touch upon?
I don't believe so. Just to note that some of the housing repair programs are managed in-house by Department of Community and Economic Development, but then we also have some organizations that partner with us in providing repair programs to the community, and that would be Habitat for Humanity and Commission on Aging. And then H&DP, they also assist with down payment assistance program utilizing CDBG funds for home buyers. And again, the goal was to have a more detailed presentation on the CDBG action plan approval, where we will get into, I think, more detail of the proposed microenterprise grant program assistance, the public service breakdown. We had the Public Service Review Committee assist us with reviewing the public service applications, and then again, any other questions at that time. Also, I believe we have applications in from nonprofit organizations this fiscal year for public facility improvements. So we have some funding in a line item for public facility loans, and we want to discuss that in more detail in June as well, and the possibilities with that funding.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we want to touch upon one of our other governmental funds that is definitely not as, what doesn't fall into the category when we classify it, or in the accounting world that we would classify it as a major fund, like the general fund is, but it is very important. And in economic redevelopment, this is where the majority, and now almost all of our incentive programs are administered and will be reflected. In the past, and actually prior to fiscal year 22, some of the incentives were kept and administered and charged through the general fund's community and economic development budget. So there was often times where there was expenditures in the general fund in their department that was incentives, and still also separately in the economic redevelopment. And we just are trying to put them all in one place so that we can put a little bit more line item details out there and make them, again, one of those things where everybody can kind of see where we're spending our monies and all the different incentive programs that we have available to us that we're using. If we look, this is section 4, page 12, and I think I might have just had that, I'm hoping that's a chart that I put in your packets. The Economic Redevelopment Fund, we are showing, and I should have said that when Jonathan said here, so I'm very sorry. Fiscal year 20 is actual information and it's audit. The middle two columns is current fiscal year 21. The first one is our fiscal year 21 budget. The second is fiscal year 21 estimated projections, where we think we're going to be by June 30. And then last but not least, the final column is fiscal year 22 proposed budget. When we look at the far right, you know, the percentage changes don't look out of line when we look at most departments. When you look at this department, if you look at the percentages, it's definitely not going to be the case. There's huge percentage change numbers. And it's comparing fiscal year 22 budget to fiscal year 21. At the top, so this fund, we get funding primarily from a couple different ways. We have been really fortunate that we were able to secure through the state of Maryland community legacy grant programs, and some of the dollars that we get we're able to utilize for incentives, and no specific grants that we utilize for incentives we include and reflect here. But primarily the major funding sources are monies that we are setting aside and transferring from the general fund. So to put the monies here, we have to find a way to balance that in our general fund. And as we go down and look through, we have a line item where we try to split out and give information, because the general fund not only transfers money to use for programs like our PEP program, which is our Partners in Economic Progress, but several years ago, the Mayor and Council Administration body set aside an earmarked property tax rate increase of 3 cents. That we utilize that for Invest Hagerstown incentives. So every year we try at budget time to look at SSTAT information, figure out what our overall assessed values are, and what 3 cents when that dollar looks like, and transfer that money over. So at the very top for fiscal year 22, we've included some dollars there, again, for Community Legacy Grant for about $275,000. Actually, $200,000 of that is monies that we were already awarded to be used towards other student housing projects. So you'll see the grant dollars there, and then a little further you'll see where we're spending it. Interest on investments, that line is very small. Again, it's been next to nothing across all the funds for fiscal year 21, and we don't see a rebound on the Federal Reserve interest rates just yet. The other revenue line, under economic redevelopment, there is one property where we have a tenant, and that is property at Indian Lane. And so this other revenue is a reflection of both what we make from the lease from the tenant, plus we also have a lease on a cell tower that's at that property. That's the $22,289. And then in overall expenditures, you can see we have, first up, administrative expenditures, anticipating about $20,000 to spend there. Administrative expenditures are primarily legal expenses and audit expenses. Come down, you see, again, we're very bad about using these acronyms, but we've got PEP subsidized rent payments, and we need to actually update that title because it is PEP, it is our Partners in Economic Progress, and it's one of those things, I know we talk a lot about our Invest Hagerstown program and how wonderful it is and those incentives, but another program that we have had that has been utilized a lot is this Partners in Economic Progress. One of the things that this program does is it waives some permit fees, which you will not see reflected here. It does allow, through a separate application process that goes through an approval, to do some rent offsets in these buildings. It also, in that line, will include PEP tax grant backs, meaning if you have a PEP building for 5 years, we will, for the change in the value, the base value before you started your renovation project, after you finished your project, the goal will be that you have got a significant increase in your assessed value, meaning your property taxes would go up. So for those first 5 years, that change in that value, we have to submit the bill, you pay us, and then we will reimburse it and send it back to you. But again, we can't waive taxes, but we can offer an incentive, very standardized incentive in that manner. Next, if we come down about halfway, you start seeing the words that say City Center redevelopment, and after them you start seeing all these words that say Invest Hagerstown. And there is 5 different lines. So we have City Center, citywide, home ownership, rental property rehab, and facade. And across those 5 categories, we have $819,000 anticipated for fiscal year 22, and that compares to $804,000 in fiscal year 21. So because we're hoping for property value increase, we're able to increase the dollars there. And then the very bottom, you see where it says Housing Catalyst Project, $221,000. $200,000 of that is actually spending the Community Legacy grant that I talked about for student housing. The other $21,650 is a result of remaining rental income guarantee that we have with one property right now. And even though we might not spend those dollars, that is the maximum amount that we have as a liability. So we like to go ahead and budget and assume worst case scenario if we would have to pay it, so that we don't overspend our dollars somewhere else and not have enough. And then it breaks down the financing sources underneath that. Just one note is for fiscal year 22, it is $1,030,000 from the general fund, but the allocation is literally $211,000 instead of $226,000. And then for Invest Hagerstown incentives, $819,000 instead of $804,000. I will note that as of yesterday, total cash available in economic redevelopment was $1.8 million. Of that total, we have $1,050,000 restricted, and the restricted is, again, the Invest Hagerstown program. So once we move these dollars over, we leave them in restricted accounts, meaning we can't use them to spend them anywhere else other than for those specific incentive programs. That leaves us about $750,000 in unrestricted cash. That was a really big, brief overview. But again, looking at fiscal year 22, spending about $1.3 million. The fund balance here that's left, I will say fund balance, one of the components of our fund balance. So let's look at fiscal year 20. We ended the year about $1.6 million in fund balance. $952,000 was committed for 2 properties that we hold, and those are 170 West Washington, which we're in the midst of, we're actually finalizing, so that will go away, and then Indian Lane. And Indian Lane currently, we have invested about $576,000. So that, again, will stay in the overall fund balance, that will stay in our restricted and committed category. Any questions?
I have a couple of questions. Actually, three specific questions. So, under expenditures, under the section, under the citywide redevelopment, the Invest Hagerstown program, while I understand very clearly the big ones, the first line, am I to assume when I see that the full funds have been expended in each of those other categories, that the funds have been expended in each of those other categories on those category items, or just fully expended out of that fund in total?
In no specific categories. So and I think Jill typically looks to come back around this time of year, every year, to say, hey, this was how fiscal year 22 budget is initially allocated. And so we have those listed for you, starting with the 500,000 down to the 55,000. And then what would happen is next April, Jill may come back and sit down and go over and provide an overall update. And if we have not specifically spent in all those categories, she may say, hey, we got, the 55,000 that we thought we were gonna do in rental property rehab. We haven't had any interested applicants. Can we go ahead and just keep that in the overall Invest Hagerstown, but use it pretty much at that point on a first come basis? Meaning we might get somebody who wants to do a city center, which the maximum would be 25,000, and maybe the rest would be done through home ownership grants, which are 7,500. We would move those monies in the budget at that point, but then on the actual side, we would put them in the buckets as we've spent them.
So, when I see the numbers in the buckets, if you will, under estimated actual, you're estimating that we'll actually spend the money in those buckets as identified? Okay, I
Yes.
mean, that's good, I just want to clarify that.
And the reason we do that is we leave them there unless unless something changes, and say Jill comes back in December and says, hey, used everything in City Center, in the largest one, and now we have another great opportunity to provide that same type of large grant. Does this body wish to reallocate all the rest of the current fiscal year to there? If we've already come back prior to the printing of the budget book and reallocated those individual buckets, then we would have shifted them in estimated projections. Otherwise, we leave them there until we come back and do an update.
All right. I think I know the answer to the second question, so I'll skip that one. The end fund balance, I know you just talked about it. I want to make sure that I'm clear when I see that 1.68 million. Are you saying that is in cash and assets, or just cash?
Cash and assets.
That's why you referred to the restricted, which aren't really cash in your hand. Okay. Because I was like, man, there's no way we're holding $1.5 million in cash with the, okay. I'm good.
Yes.
I'm good.
And Jill's on for next week for the Invest Hagerstown.
Yep, no questions on that, yep.
Okay, very good. Gonna turn it over to Brooke. We're going to do a high level of the rest. We're gonna switch gears and go to utility funds, which just means our enterprise funds.
So I'm just gonna go over some key budget highlights for each of the 3 utility funds, and then also look at each fund's project by funding source summary sheet. So starting with electric, the wholesale power contract is in place through May 31st, 2022, with an extension through May 31st, 2024. This sets both revenue and the majority of all expenses. 1 full-time position was unfunded during FY21. A $12,000 surplus is budgeted for FY22, and total unrestricted cash on hand as of May 6 is $6.6 million. In the budget book on page 30 of section 7 is the electric fund projects by funding source for a total of $814,500, primarily funded by the electric fund with a little bit of contributions by others. There's also $477,600 in general capital outlay, bringing the total to about $1.3 million. For the water fund, the cost rate model is approved and effective FY '20 through FY '24 with 3% annual increases. There is no change in full-time staffing positions, but there is a reallocation of lab staffing with the wastewater fund. A $124,000 surplus is budgeted for FY '22, and the total unrestricted cash on hand as of May 6 is $10.4 million. On page 32 of section 7 is the water funds projects by funding source, which is at a little under $2.8 million, all funded by the water fund. For the wastewater fund, the cost rate model is approved and effective FY '20 through FY '24 with 2% annual increases. There is no change in full-time staffing positions, but there is a reallocation of lab staffing with the water fund. A $1.6 million surplus is budgeted for FY '22, and total unrestricted cash on hand as of May 6 is $4.8 million. On page 34 of section 7 is the wastewater fund projects by funding source with a total of $2.6 million, primarily funded by the wastewater fund with $200,000 in grants and $250,000 in contributions.
And we're stressing unrestricted cash, because those funds all do have restricted cash in addition to that. Meaning, but again, it's restricted and can't be used for normal operations. Any questions?
I have one. Well, I mean, I'm just looking.
We've got time.
Listen, I'm just looking at this, and it sticks out as a bit of an oddity. I'm okay with $12,000 surplus in electric, and $120,000 surplus in water. I think that they're close. But $1.6 million surplus in wastewater seems high.
And the wastewater fund out of those three funds has been the one that historically and over the last several years has not had as much cash balance.
I see
and
that.
hasn't been
That's
able
the
to
lowest
do-
unrestricted cash
So
balance.
the goal was to help hold expenses and toe the line so that we could build up the cash and then be able to utilize it in other projects going forward in the out years. Especially because the rate structure there, the rate model, the service charges, if you would, for a customer are approved 5 years at a time. So we're just trying our best to make sure that we don't get in a position with wastewater where we're depleting their cash.
And I understand that. I think maybe the difficulty for me in being clear on that is two things. One is, if I recall, at some point in time, some budget that we had at a time when there were difficulties in collections for payment, I seem to remember the operational cost for maybe one or both sides, I can't remember which, was like $2 million a year for operations. So I try and apply that, and I know I shouldn't, but I'm applying that to the general fund. The general fund says, hey, you gotta have like 20%, right? And we're like 17% for the general fund, for cash on hand, for operations, right? But in this utility fund, I see that 1.6 million surplus, I see 4.8 million in unrestricted cash. And that's roughly, what, 2.5 years worth of operation. I know that that's what it is on paper. It's just when I see that and then see that we're going to apply a 2% rate increase, and I get that we're doing that because of a long-range rate model says we should do that. But as a citizen, I would look at that number and scratch my head a little and say, you got 2.5 years worth of operational cost in the bank. You got $1.5 million in surplus, and you're increasing rates.
Why are we seeing a 2% annual increase?
2% increase. I want to make sure that's not because we're continuing to have problems collecting from the customer base that aren't paying, and that it's simply because that's what the rate model is directing us long-range to do.
Okay, so I'm gonna, since we're in wastewater, I'm gonna go to the financial projection section, which was section 6, page 23, and the surplus. the amount of annual revenues over the annual expenses is 1.6. But if we come clear to the bottom where you see the net surplus / deficit, even at a 1.6 surplus, cash is only being increased by $424,000.
So the 4.8 is gonna go to 5.2?
And then if you look at the out years, so yes, so we got about 1.6 million, but that's before they have to spend 1.5 million in current debt. So debt, that they've already have done for prior projects, so they have to
Capital
pay monies back.
obligations.
So 1.5 million in principals, and then also, let's see here, 2.5 million in, capital projects.
Already, not that we're gearing up for.
No, so in fiscal year that's correct, in fiscal year 22. Yep, so if you look at that page and you stop at 1.6, that's again, current year revenue, current year expenses, but because it's an enterprise fund, it doesn't take into consideration what happens in result in, fund balance or in cash. So we try to, and it's really difficult to do it, I'll admit, but if you look at the bottom section, then it says where we're basically taking that and trying to break it back down to a cash basis, trying to put in the things that we know impact cash to reflect the bigger picture, if you will.
Things you're gonna need. Yeah, I mean, I get it. The staff person in me, the municipal staff person in me says, hey, owning a water and sewer system's like owning a used car that you're trying to fix while you're driving it.
Easy.
I was gonna say,
That's what it's like.
Easy.
peasy.
But the elected official in me is sitting there seeing this number and saying, why are we doing this to the taxpayer? And so that's, I'm struggling to reconcile those
It's
two.
like owning a boat.
Okay.
So the
well,
technical
slightly better
accounting
than that.
language is because it's an enterprise fund, just because they are repaying a loan, it's a loan. So because they're repaying on a loan, it does not reflect, the principal payment does not reflect in their expenses. And that is that is one of the largest components in wastewater.
Okay.
I got a
But
question.
utilizes the cash.
I got a question for Nancy while she's here.
Oh, perfect. Nancy, are you back there?
She is.
She is quiet this whole time.
Well, because you've done an excellent job as usual.
I'm gonna do this. Nancy, come answer his question.
And this has nothing to do with financing. Okay.
Okay.
Received an email about a stone building out at the Berkner plant that looks like it's having some issues.
Yes.
Is there a plan of action for that building?
We are working towards that. We just recently had a report of some kids entering the building and some vandalism associated with it. So we've reached out to the historic commissions, if you will, to confirm that that property is not on the historic, or that barn is not on the historic registers, and it's not. So Scott and I just talked about it a little earlier today, and I'll be putting a memo together and be requesting guidance as to what you want to do moving forward. A number of years ago, and I'm going to go back to probably around 2007, we had looked at trying to do some sort of rehab, and we were going to be pushing up against $250,000 back then because there's some real structural issues. There's also some issues associated with people being able to enter the building or enter the barn because it's been infested with various birds over the years, and there's many layers of bird droppings, which requires
A special,
yeah. So, I'll be pulling an email together per Scott's request, and we'll be working through that. We were told that there's no issue should we want to just have the building tore down from an aesthetic and a safety standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
And we'll be back at 7 o'clock for public.
We'll be here.
Thank you.
Tonight?
Yes.
I will not be here. I got my council meeting.
Isn't that convenient? Hey, up next, we have Main Street Operating Assistance Grant Application.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I am here to give an overview of a proposed grant application to the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development in support of the Hagerstown Main Street Program. I think you're probably all pretty familiar with the Main Street Program. It's a state designation, aims to bring economic vitality to traditional downtowns with five-pronged approach: design, organization, promotion, economic restructuring, and clean, safe, and green initiatives. The proposed application is for FY22 operating assistance, which the Hagerstown Main Street Program has received in the past. The overall request, financial request, is for $35,310, and the city would match that with $5,000 from the Main Street line item in the general fund. The proposed project is downtown beautification with enhanced streetscape and landscape, and the specific requests in the grant are for 3 projects. Replacement pole banners, about half of ours are deteriorated and can't be used anymore. This grant asks for funds to replace all 60 of them, the ones that hang the majority of the year, 9 months of the year. The second request is for landscaping and maintenance right at the public square to freshen up the heart of our downtown and complement other programming that we're starting to do downtown, especially post-pandemic. And the third request is for holiday decorations, and this is a continuation and evolution of the holiday cheer grant that Caitlin Bell had started last Christmas time. This would be for buying decorations to distribute to downtown Main Street businesses to make it cheerful at the holidays. The grant application is due on May 21st, and so if you are in support of this application going forward, there would be a vote during next week's special session to approve the resolution that is submitted with the grant.
Wait a minute, we need to leverage 5,000 of our dollars in order to receive 35,000 in grant monies.
We
Okay.
actually, there is actually no matching requirement at all, but I was told that they look more favorably when there's some kind of
Right.
contributed funds.
Right. Yeah, I'm good, yeah.
I'm good.
Good. Also, while you're here, can we
Yeah.
get an update on Main Street sometime soon? Like what's going on, if there's gonna be any recruitment, that kind of stuff?
Change, any changes?
Yeah.
I'm gonna look to the bosses here.
Actually, we are. We've been meeting on an overall organization change within a couple of the departments, and one of those will involve Main Street in the A&E district. We had interest in looking at moving Main Street to a nonprofit organization. We're having some problems pre-COVID finding the organization that would want to take that on or creating one ourselves. With COVID, it completely died out, and post-COVID, we're still not getting a whole lot of interest in that. So for the time being, we've decided that if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And we look to have Kitty work more closely on the Main Street program and the A&E district program, and look to kind of revitalize that over the next couple of months and get that back to a state where it's actually back to being as productive as it was when it first started, making that more desirable than for a nonprofit to take it on as more of a turnkey type situation instead of a grassroots kind of thing.
And I only said that, I was downtown at a downtown restaurant like 2 weekends ago, and there were a couple business owners from right around that area that were meeting just to have lunch and talk. And they were discussing wanting to put together a downtown group to help each other. And I was like, well, don't do that. Don't do that. Let's get you in touch with Main Street. So I think there's a want and need out there again, now that things are starting to pick up. So I think it's a good opportunity, especially with some of the new business owners we have that are very active on social media and doing different marketing plans and stuff to all join forces.
I agree. I think this is the time to reconvene a lot of initiatives right now that we're coming out of, we hope, this pandemic.
Yeah.
And I know I sound like a broken record, but I would strongly encourage engaging the Youth Advisory Council with Main Street. Did you know I was gonna say that?
Do we have a youth advisor?
There's so many things, there's so many things I could guess you might say, Shelley.
We do. I don't know if you guys forgot, but we do. I think that, their input and their, excitement would be very helpful with Main Street and
They just
understanding.
can't pick the Christmas.
There was a great article in the paper the other day too, highlighting the one of our members of the
Yes.
Youth Advisory Council too, so I think that's very nice.
And I just wanted to give a quick update that during the pandemic recovery, that our department was successful in getting a $250,000 grant to help specifically just businesses in the Main Street District. So the team has been working very hard to disperse that funding, and we will have success in supporting more than 45, close to 50 for-profit businesses with some nonprofits in the mix. But a tremendous activity during pandemic recovery, leveraging the funds from the state through the Main Street designation.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so we have a break until 7 o'clock when we're coming back for our tax hearing and proposed budget hearing. What?
Some of us are.
Yes, so we're adjourned till 7. Thank you.